I believed blood was thicker than water until my brother pushed me over a 20-foot balcony. As I lay choking on the marble floor, I heard him sobbing to the police that I tripped. My parents simply nodded, their faces stone cold. They assumed their billions and a private hospital wing would bury the truth along with my fading heartbeat. But they forgot one thing. I am a forensic data analyst, and data never lies. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Sofia Ortiz. I am 30 years old, and I make my living hunting ghosts in the machine. As a forensic data analyst for Aegis Horizon Analytics, an independent investigative firm, my days are spent sifting through digital ledgers, encrypted emails, and shadow accounts to find the lies people think they have permanently buried. I chose the name Ortiz, my maternal grandmother's maiden name, over a decade ago. It was a necessary amputation. I needed to cut away the rotting flesh of my true lineage, to escape the suffocating, monolithic shadow of the family that brought me into this world. I was born a Sterling. If you breathe the air in Chicago, you know the name. The Sterling family does not just possess wealth, they possess gravity. They are the apex predators of the financial and investment sectors, dictating market trends from their glass towers. My parents, Arthur and Victoria Sterling, are the absolute architects of this empire. They are creatures composed entirely of ego and public relations. To them, a pristine reputation is a religion, and they are its fanatical high priests. They would willingly bulldoze over any ethical boundary, destroy any life, and silence any dissenting voice just to preserve the flawless, glossy veneer of our family portrait. Growing up in their house was like living in a museum where you were severely punished for leaving footprints on the marble. The suffocating atmosphere of the Sterling household was exactly why I walked away. While my brother learned to smile for the cameras and manipulate the board of directors, I retreated into the world of mathematics and logic. Numbers were clean. Numbers did not lie to your face while smiling warmly. By the time I was 22, I had formally changed my surname, walked out of their gold-plated fortress, and refused every trust fund cent they tried to wire into my accounts. They told their social circle I was permanently studying abroad, an eccentric phase that would eventually pass. In reality, I was building a life entirely immune to their toxic influence. Then there is my brother, Julian Sterling. He is the undisputed golden boy of the American elite, blessed with my father's ruthless ambition and my mother's terrifying charisma. Julian was molded from birth to be the crown prince. He is currently the chief executive officer of MedCore X, a highly publicized health technology startup. For the past 2 years, Julian's face has been plastered across the covers of every major business magazine, hailed as a medical visionary. His crowning achievement, a revolutionary biometric monitoring device, is weeks away from securing a federal contract worth billions of dollars. While Arthur and Victoria were obsessively orchestrating a lavish, high society gala to celebrate Julian's imminent triumph, the universe decided to intervene. My firm, Aegis Horizon, was contracted to conduct a seemingly mundane cross-audit on a secondary subcontractor tied to MedCore X's supply chain. It was supposed to be a routine financial health check, a task so boring it was handed to my division just to keep us busy. But fraud, like a virus, always leaves a microscopic trail. I started noticing the discrepancies late on a Tuesday night. Small things at first, a misalignment in the temporal timestamps of the testing phases, invoices for laboratory equipment that did not match the volume of testing claimed. My parents taught me to ignore the ugly truths beneath the surface, but my profession demands the exact opposite. Driven by a cold, analytical instinct, I bypassed the standard audit parameters and slipped into the back end of MedCore X's central servers. I spent 72 hours pulling at digital threads, bypassing the cheap firewalls Julian had arrogantly paid second-rate developers to build. What I unearthed in the darkest corners of that server was not a simple embezzlement scheme or an exaggerated profit margin. It was a meticulously constructed graveyard. Julian had falsified every single line of data for the clinical trials, the performance metrics, the patient safety logs, the stress test results. All of it was a complete and utter fabrication. His groundbreaking medical device did not just fail to work, it routinely glitched and delivered lethal voltage spikes during simulated stress tests. The sheer scale of the sociopathy required to execute such a lie was breathtaking, even for a Sterling. He knew the machine was a death trap. I decrypted internal communications that proved it. In one email, Julian explicitly instructed his chief operating officer, "Just bury the negative outcomes and duplicate the positive ones. No one reads the appendix anyway." He had systematically fired the original engineering team, buried their warnings under ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and hired yes-men to stamp fake approvals on the documentation. I sat in the blue light of my monitors, staring at the raw numbers that spelled out an impending catastrophe. Julian was preparing to deploy this defective machinery into thousands of hospitals across the country. He was about to trade the lives of tens of thousands of innocent, vulnerable patients for a government contract and another magazine cover for the Sterlings. People were just collateral damage on the balance sheet. But in my world, data is absolute. The numbers do not care about your pedigree. They do not care about your tailored suits, and they certainly do not care about the Sterling name. At that moment, I realized I was no longer just an auditor looking at a spreadsheet. I was the only person standing between a megalomaniac and a mass casualty event. I transferred the entire decrypted data set onto an air-gapped, military-grade solid-state drive. It was a dense rectangle of black metal, small enough to fit inside the palm of my hand, but heavy enough to bring down a billion-dollar empire for insurance. I locked the original source files behind a multi-factor cryptographic wall on my firm's most secure offshore server at exactly 5 o'clock that evening, precisely 2 hours before the Sterling Grand Gala was set to begin. I walked into the lobby of the Sterling Tower. I bypassed the security desk and took the private executive elevator up to the 65th floor. The brushed steel doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The penthouse was immaculate and cold. Julian was standing by the window, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He looked like the untouchable king of the world, admiring his domain. "Sophia," he smiled warmly, turning around with a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. "To what do I owe this rare pleasure? Have you finally decided to rejoin the family just in time for the press photos?" "Cancel the federal contract, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the climate control system. I did not step further into the room. His perfect smile froze, but his posture remained perfectly relaxed. He took a slow, deliberate sip. "I am sorry. What did you say?" "I know about the clinical trials," I stated flatly, watching his eyes for any micro-expression of panic. "I ran the cross-audit on your secondary subcontractor. I found the shadow server you thought was hidden. I have every forged safety log, every altered patient metric, and your direct emails instructing your chief operating officer to bury the fatal voltage spikes. Your revolutionary machine is a coffin with a high-resolution touchscreen." Julian did not drop his glass. He did not gasp or stumble back. The mask of the benevolent visionary genius simply melted away, leaving behind the cold, calculating apex predator I had always known was lurking beneath his skin. He walked over to the mahogany wet bar, the ice clinking against the glass, and set his drink down. "You always were too smart for your own good, little sister," he murmured, the fake warmth entirely gone from his tone. He leaned against the black marble counter, crossing his arms. "Listen to me closely. We are talking about a government contract worth $2.5 billion. Do you understand the gravity of that number? That kind of money reshapes reality. It buys the smartest engineers on the planet. We will fix the software glitches in version 2. The initial rollout is just a stepping stone. No one ever has to know. Patience will die before version 2 even hits the drawing board, I countered, my fists clenching tightly at my sides. You are turning hospitals into execution chambers. Julian let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound and genuine irritation, as if I were a child refusing to understand basic math. I will authorize a wire transfer of $50 million into an offshore trust fund in your name by midnight tonight, completely tax-free, entirely untraceable. You can buy your own island. You can analyze data models on a beach for the rest of your natural life. Just walk away and forget what you saw. I do not want a single cent of your blood money, I said. His eyes darkened, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping to freezing. Then let us talk about what you actually stand to lose. You illegally hacked into a private corporate server. You stole proprietary trade secrets. If you breathe a single word of this to anyone, Father's legal team will have your pathetic little independent firm dismantled and bankrupt by Tuesday afternoon. I will personally see to it that you are indicted for corporate espionage. You will spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sophia, no one will ever hire you again. I am not afraid of you, Julian, I said, meeting his dead, shark-like stare without blinking. Or father, or any of the high-priced suits you keep on retainer. You have exactly 12 hours. If you do not publicly withdraw your bid and scrap the entire MedCore project by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am handing the physical drive over to the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Have a wonderful evening. I turned on my heel and walked back into the elevator, leaving him standing in the absolute silence of his glass cage. 2 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Heritage Hotel was a blinding, deafening sea of diamonds, raw silk, and unchecked hypocrisy. Hundreds of the wealthiest political donors, venture capitalists, and socialites clinked crystal champagne flutes under massive chandeliers that cost more than most people would earn in their entire lifetime. I stood near the edge of the cavernous room, dressed in a muted charcoal gown, holding a glass of sparkling water. I felt like a ghost haunting my own family's victory celebration. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and predatory ambition. Every single time I looked up, I felt Julian's gaze burning into the back of my neck. He was holding court near a massive ice sculpture carved into the MedCore logo, flashing his winning smile for the press photographers, shaking hands with influential senators, but his eyes constantly darted toward my position. He was tracking my every movement like a sniper waiting for a clear shot through the crowd. The jarring contrast between the triumphant orchestral music swelling in the background and the invisible, silent war raging between my brother and me made my skin crawl. At exactly 9:45, my phone vibrated intensely inside my clutch. I pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number flashing on the bright screen. VIP, mezzanine corridor, East Wing, 5 minutes. Let us make a final agreement. Do not make a scene. I slowly looked up toward the second-floor balcony. The mezzanine level was strictly reserved for high-level security personnel and private VIP meetings. It would be completely deserted right now while the main speeches were kicking off downstairs. I knew walking up those stairs was a tremendous risk. Perhaps a fatal miscalculation. Julian was a man backed into a corner, and a cornered sterling was the most dangerous animal on the face of the earth. I slipped my phone back into my purse and snapped it shut. On my left wrist, I wore a custom-built smartwatch, heavily modified by a paranoid hardware engineer I trusted implicitly. I tapped the sapphire glass screen 3 times, navigating swiftly past the standard dummy interface. I activated the continuous ambient audio recording protocol, ensuring the microphone was highly sensitized. Then, I swiped left and engaged the onboard accelerometer and gyroscope, setting them to measure and log high-frequency impact vectors. If he tried to grab my arm or physically intimidate me in that empty hallway, I would have the raw digital proof to add physical assault to his impending federal indictment. I took a deep, shaky breath, the cold metal of the watch pressing reassuringly against my racing pulse. and began the long, agonizing walk toward the marble staircase. The air in the VIP mezzanine corridor was startlingly cold, entirely devoid of the suffocating heat and the chaotic hum of the grand ballroom below. Thick, noise-canceling carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps, creating an eerie, vacuum-like silence. I found Julian waiting near the furthest end of the walkway, standing flush against the heavy, tempered glass railing that overlooked the main foyer. The golden light from the massive crystal chandeliers below cast long, distorted shadows across his face. He had stripped off the mask of the charming, unbothered executive. His tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his silk bow tie pulled loose, and a visible sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He was pacing with the frantic, erratic energy of a cornered predator. As I approached, he stopped abruptly and closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. There was no attempt at negotiation, no smoothly delivered corporate bribes, and absolutely no pretense of sibling affection. "Give me the master decryption sequence," Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a barely contained violent rage. "Give me the 24-character alphanumeric code for the offshore cloud drive, and hand over the physical keys to the safety deposit boxes. Now, do not test me tonight. You are going to undo this right now." I stood my ground, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. "The protocol is locked," I told him, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "The automated deadman switch activates at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You cannot stop it. Julian, there is no back door. You cancel the federal contract, or the authorities get everything. Those are the only 2 paths forward." His eyes went wide, not with fear, but with an absolute, unhinged fury, the kind of rage that bypasses logic and taps into pure, primal destruction. He took another step forward, violating my personal space, his breathing heavy and jagged. "You arrogant, sanctimonious little parasite," he spat, his hands balling into fists. "You think you can dismantle my entire life because of some misplaced moral superiority? You are nothing. You are a glorified calculator." I realized then, with a sharp spike of genuine terror, that he was not going to yield. The calculation had changed. I was no longer a sibling or a business obstacle. I was an immediate threat to his survival that needed to be neutralized. I immediately took a defensive step backward, my heel clicking loudly against a small section of exposed marble near the edge of the carpet. I opened my mouth, drawing in a sharp, deep breath, fully intending to scream for the armed private security guards stationed at the stairwell. Before I could force a single sound from my throat, Julian lunged. He moved with a terrifying, explosive speed. Both of his hands slammed directly into the center of my chest. The sheer, brutal force of the impact knocked the air completely out of my lungs. It was not a shove meant to intimidate. It was a deliberate, violent strike designed to launch me backward. My feet left the ground entirely. I felt the horrifying sensation of my center of gravity shifting irreversibly past the point of no return. My lower back collided violently with the top edge of the thick-tempered glass railing. For a fraction of a second, I teetered on the precipice, my arms flailing wildly, desperately clawing at the empty air, searching for anything to anchor myself. Then, I went over. The sensation of freefall is profoundly unnatural. Time seemed to fracture, stretching out into agonizing, hyper-focused milliseconds. The ambient noise of the party below suddenly rushed up to meet me, a chaotic roar of music and laughter that I was hurtling toward at 32 feet per second squared. I saw the glittering, multifaceted crystals of the chandeliers blurring past my peripheral vision. I felt the freezing rush of air tearing at my clothes. The impact was absolute and catastrophic. I slammed into the unyielding expanse of the foyer's imported marble floor. The sound of my own body breaking was deafening, a sickening, wet crunch that echoed inside my skull. It felt as though a freight train had driven directly through my torso. The pain was not sharp. It was an all-consuming, blinding white fire that instantly overloaded every nerve ending in my body. My ribs splintered inward, instantly collapsing my right lung. I lay there, twisted at a grotesque angle, completely paralyzed, gasping frantically like a fish thrown onto dry land. But absolutely no oxygen would enter my system. I was drowning in the metallic, copper taste of my own blood filling my throat, through the fading, hazy tunnel of my vision. I looked straight up, 20 feet above me, standing perfectly still behind the glass barrier, was Julian. He was not screaming. He was not calling for a medic. He simply stared down at my broken body with a chilling, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing an insect crushed under a microscope. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying serenity. Then, the darkness rushed in, swallowing the light, the pain, and the image of my brother's cold eyes. I do not know how many hours or days ceased to exist. Consciousness returned to me in agonizing, fragmented waves. The first thing I registered was the rhythmic, synthetic hiss of a mechanical ventilator forcing air into my damaged lungs. Then came the smell, the sharp, abrasive chemical odor of medical-grade bleach and iodine. I slowly pried my eyelids open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit searing my retinas. My body was encased in a prison of plaster, rigid cervical collars, and tight synthetic bandages. Intravenous tubes snaked into the veins of both my arms, pumping a steady stream of heavy narcotics and antibiotics into my bloodstream. Every micro movement, even the simple act of blinking, sent fresh shockwaves of agony radiating outward from my shattered ribcage and fractured spine. Through the thick, foggy haze of the painkillers, the blurred shapes at the foot of my bed slowly resolved into sharp focus. My father, Arthur, stood in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hands clasped behind his back. My mother, Victoria, stood beside him, draped in dark cashmere, wiping at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Standing opposite them was a uniformed detective from the Chicago Police Department, holding a small black notepad. They were not demanding justice. They were not screaming for the arrest of the man who had just tried to murder their daughter. They were seamlessly executing a crisis management protocol. "It is an absolute tragedy, Detective," my father was saying, his baritone voice dripping with practiced, mournful gravitas. "She has always struggled with her limits. She consumed at least 4 glasses of vintage champagne on an empty stomach before the reception even officially began. We warned her to slow down. She was wearing those ridiculous 6-inch stiletto heels," my mother chimed in, her voice trembling with expertly feigned maternal sorrow. "She simply lost her footing near the edge of the balcony. She tripped. It all happened in a fraction of a second." Julian. Oh, poor Julian. He was standing right there. He lunged forward to grab her arm, to pull her back, but he missed her by mere inches. He is absolutely devastated. He blames himself for not being fast enough to save his little sister. A wave of pure, suffocating nausea washed over me. Far worse than the physical trauma of the fall. They were actively writing me out of reality. They were burying the truth under a mountain of carefully constructed, socially acceptable lies. The audacity of their fabrication was monstrous. The detective nodded sympathetically, jotting down their poison in his notebook. He then stepped closer to the side of my bed, noticing that my eyes were open. "Miss Ortiz," the detective said gently, leaning in, "I know you are in an immense amount of pain. Can you hear me? Do you have any memory of how you went over the railing tonight?" I summoned every microscopic ounce of willpower I possessed. I fought through the heavy, suffocating blanket of the painkillers and the searing agony in my chest. I opened my mouth, my throat raw and scraped from the intubation tube that had recently been removed. I croaked, the sound barely a raspy, pathetic whisper. "He pushed me." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to plummet. Before the detective could even register the syllables I had just forced out, my mother lunged forward. She grabbed my right hand. To the detective, it looked like a desperate, comforting gesture from a terrified mother, but under the blanket, her manicured acrylic nails dug viciously into the soft, bruised flesh of my palm. pressing down with a vicious, warning pressure that sent fresh spikes of pain up my arm. "Oh, my sweet, delirious girl," Victoria cried out, her voice pitching an octave higher into a perfect tone of panicked despair. She turned immediately to the detective, her grip on my hand tightening until I thought the bones would crack. "The chief neurologist warned us about this just an hour ago. She suffered a severe grade 3 traumatic brain injury when her skull impacted the marble. They said she would experience severe auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, extreme confusion. She does not know what she is saying. Officer, the poor thing cannot even recognize her own family right now." "I understand. Mrs. Sterling," the detective said respectfully, closing his notepad and taking a step back, completely disarmed by her flawless performance. "Head trauma is incredibly unpredictable. We have multiple eyewitness statements from the ground floor confirming she was alone on the balcony edge before the fall. We will classify this as a tragic accidental fall. I will leave your family to heal. Please let us know if you need anything at all." "Thank you, Detective. Your discretion means the world to us," my father replied smoothly, shaking the man's hand and guiding him out of the sterile room. The heavy soundproof wooden door clicked shut. The instant the latch engaged, the maternal facade melted off my mother's face like hot wax. She dropped my hand in disgust, wiping her fingers on her skirt as if she had just touched something diseased. She did not say a single word to me. She merely gave me a look of profound, chilling disappointment, a look that conveyed exactly how inconvenient my continued survival was to their public relations strategy. 10 minutes later, the door slowly pushed open again. Julian walked into the room. He looked disheveled, entirely by design. He was not wearing his jacket or tie. His dress shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot and puffy, as if he had spent the last several hours weeping uncontrollably in a hospital corridor. He stopped at the nurse's station just outside my glass wall, burying his face in his hands, playing the role of the traumatized, heartbroken older brother to absolute perfection. I watched a young, sympathetic nurse place a comforting hand on his shoulder. He offered her a brave, tragic smile, then pushed the heavy door open and stepped into my room. The nurse walked away. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing us inside the quiet hum of the medical machinery. Instantly, the tears vanished, the slump in his shoulders disappeared. His posture straightened into the arrogant, dominant stance I knew too well. He walked slowly to the side of my bed, looking down at the tangled mess of wires, tubes, and broken bones he had created. He reached out and casually adjusted the flow rate monitor on my intravenous stand, a subtle, terrifying reminder of how easily he could end things right here. He leaned down, bringing his face so close to mine that I could smell the expensive bergamot cologne clinging to his skin, mixing violently with the scent of clinical antiseptic. His eyes were completely void of human empathy. Two black, empty pools of calculation. "You see, Sophia," Julian whispered, his voice smooth, low, and terrifyingly calm, vibrating directly into my ear. "You can have all the raw data and encrypted files in the entire world, but out here, in the real world, truth is decided by the people who write the checks. You are heavily medicated, you have a documented severe brain injury, you are paranoid and hostile." He smiled, a thin, razor-sharp curve of his lips. "No one believes a crazy person. Little sister, rest well." I did not stay in the intensive care unit for long. 72 hours after I woke up, my parents' legal team executed a flawless, ruthless maneuver, citing my supposed traumatic brain injury and temporary psychological instability. They petitioned a sympathetic judge for an emergency medical conservatorship before I could even request a public defender or contact my colleagues at Aegis Horizon. My fundamental rights as an autonomous adult were legally stripped away. I was quietly discharged through a private subterranean loading dock, placed into the back of an armored medical transport, and driven 50 miles north to the Sterling family's secluded summer estate in Lake Forest. They called it a private recovery sanctuary. It was a velvet prison. The sprawling, 10,000 square foot mansion sat on 20 acres of heavily wooded land, surrounded by 12-foot high wrought iron gates, two private security contractors, massive men with empty eyes and concealed holsters, patrolled the perimeter and stood outside my bedroom door 24 hours a day. My cell phone had been permanently confiscated. The landlines were physically ripped from the walls. The estate's wireless internet network was locked down tightly with enterprise-grade encryption, and signal jammers were discreetly installed in the attic to kill any cellular reception. But the physical isolation was nothing compared to the chemical warfare. My father had retained a highly discreet private physician, a man who clearly prioritized his exorbitant retainer fee over his medical oath. Twice a day, this doctor would visit my heavily shadowed room. He spoke in soothing, condescending tones as he administered heavy doses of synthetic sedatives. Initially, the drugs were pushed directly through an intravenous line. For the first 2 weeks, I lived in a suffocating, terrifying twilight. Time lost all meaning. The walls seemed to breathe, and I was trapped in a perpetual paralyzed nightmare where I could hear my own thoughts but could not move my tongue. Survival instinct, however, is a remarkable thing. As my fractured ribs began to knit together and the acute physical agony lessened, the doctor transitioned me from intravenous injections to heavy oral barbiturates. That was their critical mistake. I became a master of the silent performance. When the doctor handed me the cup of bitter sedative tea, I would pretend to take a deep swallow, subtly pouring the dark liquid into a thick washcloth hidden beneath my blanket. I would let my eyes roll back, let my jaw go slack, and mimic the shallow, rhythmic breathing of a heavily medicated patient. The moment he left the room and the heavy oak door clicked shut, I would frantically bundle the damp cloth into a plastic bag and shove it deep inside the lining of my mattress. It took 7 agonizing days of this grueling charade to clear the chemical fog from my brain. I spent those days lying perfectly still, mapping the routine of the house. I tracked the guard shift changes by the sound of their heavy boots on the hardwood floors. I memorized the exact timing of the maids' cleaning schedules. My opportunity arrived on a Tuesday night. My parents had to attend a mandatory, high-profile charity auction in the city, an event they could not miss without arousing suspicion from the financial press. The security detail was relaxed, assuming I was securely unconscious, upstairs. At midnight, I slipped out of my bed. The pain in my chest was still a blinding, jagged knife with every breath, but the adrenaline overrode it. I crept down the grand staircase, staying strictly to the extreme edges of the steps where the antique wood was least likely to creak. I bypassed the main hallway, cutting through the darkened service corridors until I reached my father's private study. The heavy mahogany doors were locked, but my father was a creature of arrogant habit. He always left the emergency override key hidden inside a hollowed-out volume of a classic novel on the hallway bookshelf. I found it, turned the lock, and slipped inside the cavernous, leather-scented room. I booted up his desktop computer. My father, believing his home network was impenetrable, had left his master financial directory entirely unencrypted. I began pulling up the private ledgers of the Sterling Family Trust. I was looking for leverage, perhaps a record of bribes paid to the hospital or the police. What I found was infinitely worse. It was a revelation so shocking it made my knees buckle. My parents were not just covering up Julian's crime to protect the family name. They were directly, financially complicit in the entire fraud. According to the hidden transaction logs, the Sterling Family Trust had quietly diverted $450 million of their investors' capital directly into the shell companies backing Medcore. My father had leveraged the entire family empire on Julian's fake medical device. If Julian's clinical data fraud was exposed, the government contract would vanish. Medcore would instantly collapse. But more terrifyingly, the Sterling Investment Fund would be exposed for massive misappropriation of funds. My parents would not just lose their social standing, they would be completely bankrupted, indicted for federal securities fraud, and sentenced to decades in prison. I stared at the glowing screen, the final, horrifying puzzle piece snapping into place. The night of the gala. They knew. Julian had not acted entirely alone in a moment of panic. My parents knew I was going to blow the whistle, and they had implicitly authorized my execution. I was not a daughter. I was a massive financial liability that threatened their freedom. Bile rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I needed physical evidence. I began searching the room, tearing through desk drawers and filing cabinets. Finally, behind a heavy oil painting, I found my mother's secondary wall safe. It was an older biometric model. Having watched her open it 100 times throughout my childhood, I knew she used her right index finger. I also knew she kept a spare set of silicone fingerprint molds in her vanity drawer upstairs for her assistant to access documents when she was traveling. I had swiped the mold earlier that evening. I pressed it against the scanner. A green light flashed, and the heavy steel door popped open. Inside, nestled among diamond necklaces and bearer bonds, was my custom smartwatch. The screen was completely black. The battery had been entirely drained for weeks. But I am a data analyst. I knew the internal solid-state memory drive did not require a continuous power source to retain its encoded files. The impact vectors, the audio recordings, the undeniable proof of my attempted murder, it was all still in there, waiting in the dark. I slipped the heavy metal watch into the deep pocket of my robe, locked the safe, and disappeared back into the shadows of the house, a ghost preparing to burn their empire to the ground. The physical isolation of the estate was absolute, but the Sterling's reliance on modern luxury was their critical vulnerability. They had disabled the wireless networks and jammed cellular signals, but they forgot about the hardwired infrastructure. Bolted to the wall of my bedroom was a massive 85-inch smart television, directly connected to the central Ethernet switch of the house for seamless ultra-high-definition streaming. At 3 o'clock in the morning, while the guard outside my door was loudly chewing gum and shifting his weight, I pulled the television away from its bracket just enough to access the rear panel. I ripped the data cable from the streaming box and plugged it directly into the diagnostic port of the television. Using nothing but the standard infrared remote control, I accessed the hidden developer menu. It took me nearly 2 hours of excruciatingly tedious typing using the on-screen keyboard to bypass the local firewall, tunnel through an unsecured subnetwork, and open a raw command line interface. I typed out a highly compressed, heavily encrypted distress signal. I sent it to a secure, anonymous Dropbox monitored exclusively by Marcus. Marcus was the senior penetration tester at Aegis Horizon Analytics, a man whose paranoia matched my own, and the only colleague I trusted with my life. The message contained a backdoor access key to the estate network and a simple directive. I need a magnetic dock and an untraceable connection. Exactly 48 hours later, a heavy commercial utility van pulled up to the heavily fortified front gates of the property. From my second-story window, I watched a man wearing grease-stained overalls step out, holding a clipboard and an oversized tool bag. It was Marcus, flawlessly playing the role of an emergency ventilation technician. He had triggered a cascading error in the mansion's climate control software remotely, forcing the estate manager to call for immediate maintenance to prevent the wine cellar from overheating. The guards patted him down, but they were looking for weapons, not microelectronics hidden inside a hollowed-out voltage meter. An hour later, Marcus was escorted into my wing of the house to inspect the ductwork. When the guards stepped down the hall to answer his radio, Marcus slipped into my ensuite bathroom. We did not exchange a single word. He pressed a small black magnetic charging dock and a cheap plastic burner phone into my palm, gave me a sharp nod, and slipped back out before the guard returned. I hid under the heavy duvet, creating a dark tent, and connected my dead smartwatch to the magnetic dock. The screen flickered to life, the battery indicator slowly climbing to 5%, then 10%. My hands shook violently as I paired the watch to the burner phone via a short range. Encrypted Bluetooth handshake. The data had survived. I opened the raw telemetry files first. The accelerometer and gyroscope had logged a massive, violent spike at exactly the moment I went over the railing. The graph did not show the gentle curve of a drunken stumble or a sudden loss of balance. It showed a horizontal, blunt force impact measuring over 1,200 newtons. That is the equivalent physical force of a heavy motorcycle colliding with a pedestrian. It was undeniable, mathematical proof that I had been violently shoved. But the audio files were what truly froze the blood in my veins. I put the cheap earbuds in and played the ambient recording. First, I heard my own footsteps in the mezzanine. Then, Julian's frantic demands for the passwords. I heard the sickening, heavy thud of his hands slamming into my chest, followed by the terrifying rush of wind. But the recording had started earlier than I realized. The highly sensitized microphone had picked up audio from the moment I activated it on the ground floor, cutting through the background noise of the gala. I isolated a specific vocal track and amplified it. It was Julian, standing near the ice sculpture, speaking quietly into a hidden earpiece just minutes before he texted me to meet him upstairs. "She is not backing down," Julian whispered urgently. There was a pause as he listened to the voice on the other end. "I know what is at stake, Father," Julian hissed back, "but she has the physical drive." Another pause. Then, the audio captured the muffled, distinct baritone voice of my father bleeding through the earpiece speaker. "Deal with her," Arthur Sterling commanded coldly. "Do not let her ruin the signing. Make it look like a tragic mistake." I sat in the dark, the horrific reality washing over me. It was not just an impulsive act of violence. It was a sanctioned execution, ordered by my own father. I texted Marcus on the burner phone. "We need to leave tonight." The extraction plan required surgical precision. Marcus had already mapped the security camera blind spots using the network backdoor I provided. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Marcus executed a localized script that intercepted the live feed of the perimeter cameras. He seamlessly spliced in a 90-second loop of empty hallway and quiet lawn footage. To the guards sitting in the security room, the monitors showed a perfectly peaceful estate. In reality, I was sprinting. I slipped out of my bedroom window, ignoring the searing pain in my healing ribs, and shinnied down the thick ivy trellis clinging to the stone facade. I darted across the manicured lawn, keeping low to the ground, and reached the glass greenhouse at the southern edge of the property. Marcus had cut the padlock. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, navigated through the humid rows of orchids, and slipped through the rear utility hatch directly into the dense woods. Marcus was waiting in a dark sedan with the engine turned off half a mile down the rural highway. I threw myself into the passenger seat, gasping for air. "Where to?" Marcus asked, putting the car in drive. "The local precinct?" "No," I said, catching my breath. "My father owns the local police chief. He probably pays his mortgage. If we go to the local authorities, I will be back in that medically induced coma before sunrise." I looked down at the burner phone, holding the digital ghost of my family's empire in the palm of my hand. "Drive straight to the state capitol," I ordered. "We are going directly to the office of the state attorney general. And step on it. We have an empire to burn." The auditorium at the National Convention Center was a blinding theater of absolute arrogance. Hundreds of flashbulbs erupted in a continuous, chaotic strobe light as my family stood on the center stage. My brother, Julian, wore a bespoke navy blue suit, flashing his trademark billion-dollar smile for the press. Flanking him were my parents, Arthur and Victoria, the proud architects of this monumental deception. Today was the day MedCorp was scheduled to formally ink the federal contract. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with health department officials, venture capitalists, and the elite press corps of the entire country. Behind them, a massive, 50-foot-high light emitting diode screen displayed the glossy animated logo of their fraudulent company. It was the absolute zenith of the Sterling Empire, and it was the exact moment I chose to detonate the bomb. Sitting in an unmarked surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, Marcus hit the final execution command on his encrypted terminal. Inside the convention center, the transition was violently abrupt, the corporate music echoing through the massive stadium speakers cut off with a harsh, high-pitched screech of digital feedback, the glowing MedCorp logo fractured into a chaotic storm of dead pixels. A collective murmur of confusion swept through the audience of over 1,000 people. Julian tapped his microphone, his perfect smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he looked back at the screen. The static cleared, in bright, unforgiving white lines against a pitch-black background. A raw telemetry graph materialized. It was the data from my smartwatch. The horizontal axis represented time, and the vertical axis measured physical force. A bright red line spiked violently across the screen, hitting 1,200 newtons. Below it, my heart rate monitor displayed the terrifying, erratic spikes of a body going into immediate physical shock. Before anyone in the room could process the mathematics on the screen, the silence was shattered by a voice. The auditorium sound system, dialed to maximum volume, broadcasted the crystal-clear audio file. The cold, sociopathic tone of my brother echoed off the vaulted ceilings. You can have all the raw data and encrypted files in the entire world, but out here, in the real world, truth is decided by the people who write the checks. The sound of his menacing chuckle followed. No one believes a crazy person, little sister. The reaction was instantaneous. A shockwave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Julian's face drained of every ounce of blood, turning a sickly, ashen gray. He stumbled backward, dropping the ceremonial pen onto the polished wooden podium. But Marcus was just getting started. Exactly 3 seconds later, every single cellular phone, tablet, and smart device inside that convention center vibrated in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Marcus had hijacked the venue's internal wireless network to execute a massive targeted data drop, thousands of pages of falsified clinical data, suppressed safety logs detailing lethal voltage spikes, and internal emails proving Julian's direct knowledge of the failing medical devices were instantly downloaded into the hands of every journalist, investor, and government official in the room. The room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Reporters were shouting over each other, holding their phones up to the stage. The heavy, reinforced oak doors at the rear of the auditorium swung open. The noise in the room died down, parting like a sea as I stepped into the aisle. I was flanked by the state attorney general and a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers. I walked slowly down the center aisle, with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I reached up and unfastened the heavy, rigid cervical collar, holding my fractured neck in place. I tossed it onto an empty velvet chair. I was no longer the invisible, heavily sedated daughter locked away in a velvet prison. I was the executioner. "Sophia!" my mother shrieked into the microphone, her voice a hysterical, cracking pitch that completely shattered her pristine high society facade. "What have you done?" Federal agents swarmed the stage, securing the perimeter and physically blocking the exits. The Attorney General stepped forward, holding a thick stack of warrants. My father, realizing the entire empire was evaporating in front of his eyes, immediately went into survival mode. He grabbed the microphone from Julian's trembling hand. "This is a misunderstanding," Arthur bellowed over the chaotic din of the press. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Julian. "This boy acted entirely on his own. The Sterling Trust had absolutely no knowledge of his fraudulent clinical data or his horrific actions against his sister. He lied to us. He lied to the board. We will cooperate fully with the authorities to ensure he faces justice." Julian spun around, staring at our father with an expression of pure, unadulterated betrayal. The golden boy was being thrown to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. I looked up at the security camera mounted above the balcony. Knowing Marcus was watching the feed, I gave a subtle nod. The massive screen behind them flashed again. A second audio waveform appeared. It was the background recording from the night of the gala. The audio captured before the push. My father's distinct, authoritative baritone voice boomed through the speakers, freezing him exactly where he stood. "Deal with her," my father's voice echoed, cold and calculating. "Do not let her ruin the signing. Make it look like a tragic mistake." The silence in the auditorium was absolute and deafening. The perfect, untouchable faces of Arthur and Victoria Sterling crumbled into expressions of utter, horrifying humiliation. There was no public relations spin to fix this. There were no bribes large enough to make the Attorney General disappear. The agents moved in simultaneously. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly into the microphones as they were violently secured around the wrists of my brother, my father, and my mother. The lead agent read them their rights, citing massive corporate fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and severe obstruction of justice. The press corps rushed the stage, cameras flashing wildly as the untouchable royalty of Chicago were dragged away like common street criminals. 3 weeks later, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my office at Aegis Horizon Analytics. On the television screen mounted on the far wall, a news anchor was breaking down the spectacular, fiery collapse of the Sterling Empire. Their assets were frozen, their mansions seized by federal authorities, and their company liquidated to pay the massive fines. They were facing multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. I turned the television off. The silence that filled my office was beautiful. I had permanently severed every tie to my former life. I am Sophia Ortiz, and my job is to drag the darkest, most expensive lies out into the unforgiving light. For the first time in 30 years, despite the deep, aching scars crisscrossing my ribcage, I finally took a deep breath of truly free air. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Daisy Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.